All right, we are still in chapter 23 and now going to pick up a section called Reforms and Revolutions. And we've spent the last few days talking about and really learning deeply about the ideologies of 19th century Europe: liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, socialism, and Marxism. And in this section, what's going to happen from about 1815 to 1848 is that liberalism, nationalism, and socialism all join forces at different times to attack the conservatives who ruled at the time in Europe after Napoleon. And this is all going to culminate in big rebellions in 1830 in France, in 1848 in France again, and in Germany, Austria, and several other places in Europe. And that's not what happened in all of Europe, though. You'll see at the beginning of this section there are two stories that diverge from that pattern: the Greeks and people in Great Britain. The transformations of Great Britain don't really follow that pattern of rebellion against conservatives. You'll see those differences here in a moment. So let's dive right in. Section A, National Liberation in Greece. So for the longest time that we've been studying European history, since about 1450, the Greeks were ruled by the Ottoman Turks. And you know the Ottoman Turks are Muslim. You know that Greeks are Orthodox Christian. And so that wasn't going to work for very long. It worked for several hundred years, but by about 1820, there's a nationalist movement that rises in Greece. And you're going to see a dramatic success in the Greek Revolution against the Turks, perhaps unlike anything else that we see in this period of history. The revolt starts in around 1820, led by a very famous Greek patriot whose name was Alexander Ypsilanti. He's a military man. Now, if the Greeks had just tried to fight the Turks on their own, they would have lost. As you know, the Ottoman Turks had a huge empire that dominated southeastern Europe and most of the Middle East. And there's a reason why the Greeks waited so long to launch their rebellion. They needed help. And what happens by 1820 is that other nations in Europe and even the Americans lent their support to a Greek revolution, and it became kind of a holy cause. Europeans and Americans loved studying Greek history. They loved the classics. Greece was the birthplace of democracy and of Western civilization. And people knew that at this point. They knew it always, but it really sort of motivated people in a different way. The Renaissance, as you recall, was all about bringing back Greek ideas. And so particularly here, you're going to see the British, the French, and the Russians came to the aid of the Greeks militarily. The Americans gave moral support. We didn't go fight over there militarily, but we gave moral support. Not only did the militaries of Western European and Eastern European nations show up, but the Greek War of Independence became a motivating force for a lot of intellectuals, and a whole group of romantic poets who we now know about went down to Greece and fought militarily on the side of the Greeks against the Turks. And a famous guy that did that is named Lord Byron, one of the most famous English romantic poets. He actually goes down there and dies in battle, a poet turned warrior, giving his life, becoming a martyr for the cause of Greek independence because he believed in that nation and its history so much. So again, the Greeks were assisted by Britain, France, and Russia, who all sent their navies down to the Balkan Peninsula to ultimately crush the Ottoman Navy in 1827. You see that in this picture here, in a famous battle called Navarino. Russia went a little bit farther than that and actually took land from the Turks, basically the land that Romania sits on today, the nation of Romania. And so the Russians were using this as a pretext to take even more territory than anyone else. The British and the French were simply at this to help liberate the Greeks from the Turks. Now, the conservatives in Europe, like Metternich in Austria, opposed this whole thing. He said, even though the Turks are Muslim and it's not really right necessarily, remember, he didn't support revolution anywhere in his little holy alliance. So there were people in Europe that did not support the Greeks rebelling in any capacity. But once the British and French are involved, there's nothing the Austrians are going to do about that. By 1830, the British, French, and Russians had declared Greece independent. And instead of choosing a Greek man for a king, they picked a German whose name was King Otto. and they installed him as the head of Greece, not by really the consent of the Greek people, but that was the trade-off for their help, is that they got to choose who became the next leader of Greece. And that's the story of the national liberation in Greece. Dramatic success against the Turks, but only with foreign intervention. The next story is called Liberal Reform in Great Britain. It's a different story altogether. Basically, what happens in England in the early 19th century is that they make gradual reforms politically, just enough so that there is no major rebellion that ever takes place in England. England has always been remarkably flexible and stable at the same time. And they avoid all these revolutions that you're going to see in other parts of Europe. But that is not to say that 18th century British society was actually very democratic at the beginning. Even though there was a glorious revolution, we've studied that from 1688, William and Mary, you have a constitutional monarch. The society is not democratic at all. It was still dominated by nobility, aristocrats. Only 8% of the people in England in the early 19th century could vote. And yet most people had basic civil rights, and so they were mostly content, unlike in other parts of Europe. And again, the British are going to make small changes to keep that pressure off. A couple of important political parties we need to know about. The Tories. The Tories are the conservatives. They represent the nobility and the aristocrats. And of course, their position is to resist, like all conservatives, all radical movements anywhere in their nation. In fact, coming out of the Napoleonic Wars, these Tories, the conservatives, tried to revise what are known as the Corn Laws. And the Corn Laws were all about stopping the importation or the bringing in of foreign grain, because nobles, primarily in England, were still they still owned large farms, and they liked to grow all of the corn and crops and sell those to the English people at high prices. And the Corn Laws said that no Englishman was allowed to buy grain from anybody else in Europe, so that it kept the price of grain very high and it enriched the nobility. Now, the lower classes hated the Corn Laws because it kept the prices too high and they weren't able to get enough to eat. So we're going to see some conflict over the Corn Laws, which again they were trying to make even stronger in their favor. The nobility wanted to keep those things in place. Protesters in England started going into the streets to protest the revision of the Corn Laws, and they're going to get crushed. Radical intellectuals, workers, hungry people everywhere went into the streets of England, and you see there's a famous battle called the Battle of Peterloo, which was a protest it started off peacefully. They simply were asking for the end of the Corn Laws so they could all eat for lower prices. And the Tories sent the army into the streets to crush these relatively innocent protesters. And it's a play on the name Waterloo, of course, where Napoleon was defeated. The Tories responded by suspending what is known as the right of habeas corpus, when that right is suspended, it means you can be arrested and held indefinitely without going to a trial. Habeas corpus is a right that if you're arrested, you have to have charges brought against you or you have to be released. And a lot of times that is suspended in wartime, where they simply arrest people and hold them in jail indefinitely. And that's what they did here. And then the Tories passed what are known as the 6 Acts, which eliminated or really heavily cracked down on freedom of the press and freedom of the assembly, which are two things that are held dear to the English people since the English Bill of Rights in 1688. So this was really going a little bit too far. After 1820, liberals start to make some gains, not workers. Workers were out here at the Peterloo protest, but liberals start to win rights. Liberals are business owners, we know that, middle class, and they want a place in society alongside the aristocrats, the Tories. So liberals start to get some things, workers not as much, as we'll see. The Whig Party is the second big political party in England, and they are the liberals. They represent the middle class, the business class, the bourgeoisie in England, although they didn't call it that. And these guys are going to campaign for a reform bill. And we'll see the workers want more things later, and they're not going to get it. But the middle classes start to make gains. They get the reform bill, and I'll tell you what it means here in a minute. by going to the king, and the king agreed to either pass the reform bill or create enough new lords in the House of Lords that they would actually pass the bill in favor of the Whigs. The key provisions of the Reform Bill of 1832, and they're not going to sound it's not really dramatic, it's not very radical, but it's just enough. The House of Commons once again emerged as the most powerful body, legislative body in the nation. The House of Commons has been growing in stature since the 100 Years' War. We know that. They had a big boost in the Glorious Revolution, then they kind of took a back seat for a century, and now they're preeminent again. The new industrial areas where all the middle class men lived started to gain equal representation in Parliament, and they got rid of what were called rotten boroughs, which were areas of England where people no longer really lived. They had moved away into cities, and yet those rural areas still had heavily more representation in British Parliament than they should have. So it was an inequity in how many, who was in British Parliament. People were there that were representing districts where no one lived, and that big cities were growing up where very few representatives were for those cities. So they rearranged their legislative and the electoral map a little bit. It's a lot like when we redistrict in Congress in America based on population. Certain states will get more people in Congress, and other states might lose some based on shifting population. Go ahead and turn over to page 9. So the result of these changes in legislative districts and in voting, it really doesn't change that much. We go from 8% of men voting to 12%. 4 more percent vote. That's not much, but it's just enough. And Britain tends to avoid revolution by just creating small reforms, little things here and there that stop any radical sentiment. And so again, we're never going to see those radical revolutions in England like we're about to see everywhere else. Now, in terms of the people, the workers, the lower classes of England, they were not happy with this, really. They were still part of the Chartist movement that we learned about in the last chapter, and those guys wanted universal male suffrage, the right of every male citizen of England to vote, even if you didn't have property, even if you were poor. They wanted total democracy. Now, this is too much, and they're not going to get it. They're going to get it in the later part of the 1800s, the 19th century, but not in the 1830s and 40s. Not going to happen. The Whigs and the Tories are not willing to give them that at that point. So because they don't get the right to vote, liberals, basically working class people and radicals, workers, and lower class liberals join what's called an anti-Corn Law League. So instead of campaigning for the right to vote, they sort of shift focus a bit and just try to make it their mission to get rid of the Corn Laws altogether. And they did have success there. In 1846, those Corn Laws are repealed by the Tories. Again, they sense rebellion, and then they'll give the people something. They'll toss them a bone, so to speak, to get them off their back. So this is a victory for free trade. It means you can buy grain from wherever you want. There's no tariffs, which are taxes on imports. You're able to buy food and grain from all over Europe. The prices go down. The workers are happy. Everyone has enough to eat. Again, workers, lower classes come out on top. Middle class businessmen are happy because now they get to trade in those goods. They get to import and export. Basically, it's win-win for all people in England. The next little bone that gets thrown to the workers and the lower classes is the 10 Hours Act from 1847. This basically said you can't work more than 10 hours, but for women and children and older children only. Not men. They're still going to work long hours, but for women and kids, it's a gradual progress for them. Basically, what you see happening here is the two political parties, the Tories and the Whigs represent the middle class, started competing for support from the working class by giving them small things here and there to stop rebellion. And it worked. Britain is slowly moving toward democracy in the 1800s. By the late 1800s, they'll have it, and they're going to avoid a lot of the violence. The next section, section C, is about Ireland and the Great Famine. Now, all of these changes that we just saw in England, oh, by the way, here's a picture of the Reform Bill in British Parliament being passed. Great movement, small movement, but part of the long process of England becoming more democratic. Now, in Ireland, the story doesn't go anything like that. Ireland does not benefit at all from these political changes in England. As you know, hopefully from the past, the English ruled Ireland brutally, like they were second-class citizens. and they made none of these changes in Ireland. On top of that, the population of Ireland was growing dramatically from about 3 million in the 1720s to 8 million by 1840. That's just like was happening in most other parts of Europe, that dramatic population growth. But the problem in Ireland is the poverty. Most people in Ireland were very poor. They did not own land. They owned land. They lived on land owned by Englishmen who charged them incredibly high rent, and it was just a brutal situation. And at this point, 1.75 million people, almost 2 million people, left Ireland. They emigrated to primarily the United States because their situation was so desperate. The only thing that was doing okay for people in Ireland was that they grew potatoes. The potato was introduced as a crop a few hundred years before, and it grew very well in Ireland. And so basically Irish peasants lived on potatoes. That's it. 10 pounds a day. The average Irishman ate 10 pounds of potatoes, and only potatoes, every single day for his diet. And they got married early, they lived in little shacks, and they had lots of babies because Irish are Catholic, and at this point that's what you do. Catholics don't practice birth control in the 19th century, and you got lots of kids. So you've got lots of help to grow more potatoes. So your whole world is dependent on potatoes. That's all that they have. Go ahead and flip the page. The problem is, in 1845, there was a huge potato famine. The potatoes failed. There was a disease that came and wiped out all the potatoes from an agricultural standpoint. And now you're poor and you're starving if you're an Irishman. A brutal situation. The government of England, which basically ruled Ireland, didn't do anything to help, as they often didn't. Mass death strikes the people of Ireland. 1.5 million people died. The ones that survived either were starving and hungry or they left. Another round of emigration. Another 1 million people in the 1840s left Ireland for primarily North America to settle in New York, Chicago, Boston. Now you're down 2.5 million people out of 8 million right in the previous 10 years. So the population of Ireland by the turn of the 20th century, about 1900, is down to 4.4 million. They lost half the population through starvation or emigration. Ironically, I just looked that number up. That's the same exact population of Ireland today, 4.4 million. So their population has stayed exactly the same in the last 115 years. And there they are, leaving, sailing away to the New World. And they hate the British. The anti-British sentiment grows. The people of Ireland blamed the English for this tragedy. Irish nationalism starts to grow. People start to demand that they just not even be a part of England anymore, that Ireland become its own separate nation, which it will, but not for a while, not until the 20th century. Then the English will finally let the Irish go. In fact, it's so bad, the hatred of the English, that their books are written about this. And one of the most interesting books, and I'll tell you about more of this in class, is a book called A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, where he's mocking the cold-heartedness of the English. But he's taking the position of an Englishman, suggesting that if the Irish situation is so bad, then why don't you just sell all these little extra babies that you have, that you keep having foolishly? Why don't you sell off your children as food to the English people? Well, it's a satire piece that mocks the cold-hearted and callousness of the British people toward Ireland in that particular, well, over the centuries, really. Section D switches over, and now we're going to talk about France. France goes through two major revolutions in 1830 and then again in 1848. France has had many revolutions. We studied the famous French Revolution from 1789 to 1815 at the end of December, and now we're going to see it all come back again. The king brought back, the Bourbon king, was Louis XVIII, who was related to Louis XVI. I think it was a cousin, something like that. And he was restored to the throne after Napoleon was defeated, a Bourbon dynasty back on the throne of France, and he's going to rule for 10 years. And he passed what was called the Constitutional Charter. That's a review from chapter 21, which basically created a liberal constitutional monarchy where most French people had freedom of speech and artistic liberties. They could publish and draw and what they wanted, but it was not a democracy at all. Only 100,000 people out of 30 million in the nation could vote. It's not very many. And what were called notables, so-called notables, still dominated French society. That included nobility that was still there, upper middle class, aristocrats, business owners of large business, but certainly not the average people or even the lower middle class or shopkeepers or anything like that. Louis VIII, this lasted for 10 years, and then Louis XVIII died in 1824. He was replaced on the throne by his brother, whose name was Charles X. And Charles X wanted nothing to do with the way his brother had ruled. In fact, he wanted to go back to the way the absolute monarchs ruled France, like Louis XIV. That was his open ambition. He's a reactionary. He's a throwback. You can even see it sort of in his face here. He doesn't look like he wants to be a part of anything modern or anything liberal at all. So right away, within about 6 years of taking the throne, he canceled the Constitutional Charter, which was the name of the Constitution that Louis XVIII had put in place. He just simply revoked it. And he said, I'm going to be an absolute monarch. I'm a divine right monarch. There is no constitution anymore. This was an attack on the middle class, really, who was being protected by that constitution. It was called the July coup, where he tried to overthrow the government, which he already led, but he was trying to take even more power. People came into the streets in July of 1830 in mass numbers. It's a mini revolution. It's called the Three Glorious Days, July 28th, 9th, and 30th of 1830. All social classes came into the streets of Paris to fight this guy and try to get him to leave. Middle class people, workers, students, everyone got on board. They didn't exactly know why, but they knew it was exciting and it was another potential time for change. Charles X abdicated. He bailed. He ran away. He fled. The people won. This famous 3 days was commemorated in the painting Liberty Leading the People by Delacroix, which you looked at just the other day when we studied Romanticism. This painting is dedicated to those 3 glorious days where the people of France rose up and tossed out their wannabe absolute monarch, Charles X. And in his place, the people they picked his cousin, whose name was Louis Philippe, who, if you look at him here, looks a little bit like Elvis to me. But he was the new king of France. And his rule from 1830 to 1848 is going to be known as the July monarchy. So lots of terms involving the word July. It's a little bit confusing, but you'll keep it straight. Louis Philippe came in with a lot of promises, but he didn't really keep them. A lot of symbolic action that ended up not producing much. For example, he brought back the Constitutional Charter. Everyone was happy. He agreed to fly the new French flag, the tricolor, the tricolore, the red, white, and blue flag of the Revolution from 1789. He said, I'll fly that flag, and he called himself King of the People. But beyond that, very little tangible things were going to change. The upper middle class was happy. They got their constitution back. It was basically like what they had in 1815, but no one else was happy. All the people that had come into the streets, particularly the lower classes, got nothing out of Louis Philippe. So people that were Republicans, that wanted republics, people that wanted universal male suffrage, Democrats, reformers, socialists, you can add to that list, they were bitter because they got nothing out of old Louis Philippe. Turn over to page 11. He lasts until 1848, Louis Philippe. And in 1848, there are major revolutions all over Europe, sparked by nationalism, where people wanted nations that weren't there and wanted advances in democracy where there were already nations. They wanted stronger constitutions, social reform. Workers started demanding socialist rights for themselves. And it all starts once again in France, the failure of Louis Philippe, Democratic Republic in France. Section B. So again, Louis Philippe, just talked about him. His rule was known as the July monarchy. It was also known as the bourgeois monarchy because he pretty much only responded to that upper middle class group and their needs. What he didn't do was really make any tangible reforms. He didn't help the lower classes. There weren't any improvements in voting rights. And just like in 1789, a series of poor harvests is going to strike the French people once again, bringing them into the streets, demanding reform. This time, by February of 1848, the situation was so bad that all kinds of people streamed into the streets of Paris. The lower middle class, I would add the word lower middle class to this. He represented the upper middle class, not the lower. So shopkeepers, students, artists, workers, these are the people that came into the city, came out into the streets to start fighting. Here they go. Barricades. This is a term that you need to know. The people in these revolutions in France, and we'll see this in the film Les Miserables, and if you've ever seen that movie, you'll see that all the time. They break up furniture and they literally barricade streets with anything they can find as an act of protest, and they try to fight the French army street by street, almost in sort of guerrilla-style warfare. So these people flow into the streets. It's rebellion again, just like 1789, and Louis Philippe abdicated. He resigned and he left the country. In his place, these revolutionaries proclaimed the Second Republic. This is big stuff. The First Republic was declared during the Revolution, the French Revolution, the first one, in 1792, when Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were no longer king and queen of France. And that was a really dramatic moment then. And so now here we have the Second Republic. We've gone through Napoleon before this. We've had Louis XVIII to another king, Louis Philippe, Charles X, but now we're back to a republic, no king. And they're going to create this revolutionary coalition of people in the street. They're going to grant universal male suffrage, which meant that everybody can vote. It's amazing, just like during the French Revolution. They freed all the slaves in French colonies around the world. They abolished the death penalty. They established a 10-hour workday for all people, even men. So pretty dramatic stuff right off the bat. But the problem is, and we'll see this repeated in several stories, this revolutionary coalition of people that came into the streets eventually broke down and they couldn't agree on their long-term strategy. Again, here's another picture of the 1848 revolutions in France, barricades, people of all social classes joining together to fight against the relatively conservative Louis Philippe. So in the streets primarily are several major groups. So we have liberal middle class capitalists. These people were unhappy with Louis Philippe. They were okay with universal male suffrage, but that's about it. That's as far as they wanted to go. They were willing to grant all men the right to vote, but nothing any more radical than that. These are business owners, small business owners usually. They wanted capitalism, liberal constitution, rights, civil liberties, but that's about it. The other masses of society in France were much more radical, and they wanted socialism, essentially. These are working class socialists, students, intellectuals, university students. They wanted a lot more than that. They wanted the socialist platform to be adopted. Particularly, they wanted what are called national workshops. They wanted government-run businesses, government factories, government-run employment opportunities to promote fairness, equality. They weren't going to be competitive. You wouldn't have to compete against someone else for the job, and you wouldn't have to compete against them once you were hired to keep a job. This is what socialists want. You know this. The liberal middle class actually said yes to the national workshops initially, but then people just streamed into them. Thousands, tens of thousands of French people, lower class, tried to sign up for these new national workshops where they'd get a government paycheck and could be guaranteed a job. So more people showed up than there was room for. Even foreigners, people came across the border even from other parts of Europe to get jobs or try to get jobs in these French national workshops. It reminds me a little bit of maybe the Obamacare controversy, where they were worried that if we opened up Obamacare, people would flood in and it would be too many. So lots of similarities here. Socialism at this point, which is what these national workshops are an example of socialism, was really frightening to the middle, upper classes in France, and even the peasants, rural peasants out in the farmland, who all owned property, and they really cared about that. And as you know, one of the socialist demands is that we eventually get rid of private property and share it all. So it freaked everyone out. So many people tried to join the national workshops that the liberals decided, the liberals, by the way, controlled this new little assembly that was making decisions. They canceled the national workshops. Now all the lower class people streamed into the streets. They go into the streets once again for another rebellion. This is now a rebellion in February of 1848 and one in June of 1848 after these national workshops were canceled. It's called the June Days. Frenchmen are fighting Frenchmen. Liberal middle class are fighting radical working class. 10,000 people killed in June of 1848, primarily lower class. Who won? You're not going to be surprised here. The middle class liberals. With the army, the French army came to defend them. Who lost? The workers, the socialists. 4 months only, this new Second Republic, from February to June of 1848, and then it's all over. They couldn't agree. And again, you're going to see this repeated several times. And in the place of this new republic, the middle class had an election, and they chose a man named Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, to take the leadership of France. Not as a king, as a president. They elected him as a president in December of 1848. And he's a strong man. He's an authoritarian. He's essentially a conservative. And what he promised them was law and order. No more revolutions. No more students in the street. I'll protect your right to do business and make money, but that's about it. The rest of it's going to run the way I want it to run. And he had a famous name, so he already had that sort of in his past, being a relative of Napoleon. And the middle class, the upper class, voted him in. The working class, once again, pretty much got nothing. Let's turn over to page 12. Revolution spread from France to other parts of Europe. It was a little bit like the Arab Spring that we had a couple years ago, where revolutions spread from nation to nation in the Middle East. Some of them were successful, some of them weren't. In this case, it spreads from France over to the Austrian Empire, which same year, 1848, they heard about what was going on in France, and now the students, liberals, socialists in Austria are going to try to do a similar thing, but sadly, perhaps, they're also going to get crushed by conservative forces, just like what happened in France. Conservatives, again, the monarchy, the aristocracy, the nobility, the army, the church, those are the people that are going to come together and ultimately stop these revolutions. So in the Austrian Empire, the revolution started with Hungarians. And you'll remember that we've studied Hungarians before. Back in chapter 17 in Eastern European absolutism, there was always a Hungarian minority in the Habsburg Empire. This goes back to Maria Theresa, Joseph II, even the enlightened absolute monarchs. You even think back to when even before them, remember that pragmatic sanction, that particular law that was passed that said the Habsburgs would never divide their land. They were always trying to keep the empire together. That's part of the theme of Austrian Habsburg history, is that the empire was always crumbling. There were always different ethnic groups there, and they were always trying to hold the thing together, including people that didn't want to be there, like Hungarians. The Hungarians had often asked for independence, autonomy. There'd been rebellions against the Austrian Habsburg before. They'd always been crushed. And so here they go again. The Hungarians go into the streets of Budapest and other places. They demanded independence, autonomy, suffrage, civil liberties. The rebellion spread from Hungary into Vienna itself, into the city of Vienna itself, where even Metternich, the father of conservatism, fled the country. He put on a disguise and left for England and spent most of the rest of his life in England. The leader of Austria, the Habsburg leader, was Ferdinand I. He was the emperor of Austria. And he started caving right away. He was freaked out. He started giving the people everything they wanted. He made them all these promises. He said, anything you want, basically, you can have. So a lot of promises made, but just like the French, the coalition of revolutionaries broke down very rapidly. And in Austria, it's even more complicated. There's 6 different groups. In Vienna, you've got the poor workers and students who are socialists, who wanted radical change, universal male suffrage. And then there's the wealthy middle class who wants a constitution, civil liberties, a more limited slate of reforms. Also in the Austrian Empire, you've got these Hungarians who wanted their own separate nation apart from the Austrians, but there's other ethnic minorities nearby the Hungarians who the Hungarians didn't really care about either, and they wanted to incorporate those ethnic minorities in the new Hungary, Czechs, Slovaks, other people. So those folks wanted even more countries of their own, lots of nationalism here, and the Hungarians weren't willing to give them what they wanted in return, so that coalition breaks down. And then there's a group, again, Czechs in the Austrian Empire that wanted a separate Czech Republic, perhaps. And then there's German nationalists that wanted a united Germany separate from Austria. So there was just all these different groups. None of them could get along. And it was very easy for the Habsburgs to play these people off of each other, which all they had to do was wait. The conservative Habsburgs wait, let these groups fight among each other, and then they're all going to come in. The conservatives are going to come in with the army, and they're going to crush the whole thing. So here they come. The army comes into Vienna and attacked workers and students. 4,000 of them were killed in Vienna. People were killed in Prague, which is basically where the Czechs were. The only thing that really changed in the Austrian revolution here, attempted revolution, was that a new emperor was chosen. Ferdinand was out. He looked weak. He came out as weak in the whole thing. And his family and the army got together and said, we got to pick somebody else. So they picked a new emperor whose name was Franz Joseph. And this guy was only 18 years old. And he's going to rule the Austrian Empire all the way down to 1916, which is in the middle of World War I. So this is the last emperor of Austria, the last Habsburg emperor of Austria, and the last emperor altogether. And the first thing he did is he called on Nicholas I of Russia, one of the Romanov czars of Russia. He said, come on over and help me crush the Hungarians. Help me settle this rebellion once and for all. And the Russians, just like they had done in that Holy Alliance with Metternich in the earlier part of the century, they sent 130,000 troops into Austria to help young Franz Joseph crush the Hungarians, which he did. So there's not going to be a Hungary until after World War I. Basically, we go back to status quo. Conservatives triumph in Austria. The last story in the last one of these rebellions takes place in Prussia. Revolution in Prussia, Section D. Same thing. The ideas of liberalism had spread from Austria over to from Austria over to Prussia. And there's middle-class liberals in Prussia that want the same things as the middle-class liberals did everywhere in Europe, which is a constitutional monarchy, a written constitution, civil liberties, freedom of speech, the opportunity to do business safely. So they're the ones that start the rebellion in Prussia, much like they had almost everywhere else in Europe, France, Austria as well. These guys also wanted Germany. They wanted a unified Germany out of their effort. As you well know, there's never been one yet. There's still 38 little states of Germany run by different princes with these two empires on each side, Austria and Prussia. It's very chaotic, so they finally wanted to bring some order to it. The revolt broke out primarily in Berlin. Here's a painting of these young liberal revolutionaries in the streets of Berlin, the capital of the Prussian Empire. And the emperor of Prussia at that time, again, remember they're always named Frederick, going back to the Hohenzollerns. It's Frederick William IV. It's a little pudgy, in my opinion. This guy made all kinds of promises, just like they always did. They thought, if I don't make promises, I'm going to lose my throne. So he promised them a constitution. He promised them a new German state, a new German nation. He said he'd work with them. But the same story has repeated itself, a breakdown of the coalition of all the different groups and what they wanted. Socialist workers and students wanting a radical program of change versus that liberal middle class that simply wanted more moderate reforms and just a constitution only and nothing else. So it's been repeated over and over. Turn over to page 13. An assembly acting on the promises of Frederick William gathered in Frankfurt, which is a city in Germany today, and they're called the Frankfurt Assembly. And their job was to write a new constitution, which the king of the Prussians had said they could. They were liberal. They were primarily liberal, so they're going to write a constitution that protects what they want. civil liberties, freedom of speech, the right to do business, all of that. They want a united Germany, so their goal is to do that as well. Now, they were somewhat self-appointed, so there was a question as to whether they were an illegal body at the time. But nevertheless, they went on writing a new constitution. That was their task. They thought they were acting on the orders of the king. They represent the wealthy middle class, but not workers. So workers, again, remember that coalition is going to break down. The workers are not part of this. This whole Frankfurt Assembly went off track when there was a little dispute with Denmark. Denmark is to the north of Prussia and Germany today. And all of a sudden, the people of Denmark heard that rebellions are happening all over Europe, and the people in Denmark started to try to take over an area called Schleswig-Holstein, which is in the northern part of Germany. And there was a war between Prussia and Denmark over this random little territory, and this totally sidetracked the work of the Frankfurt Assembly. They had to send the army in. It wasted their time. The Frankfurt Assembly was nearly done with their work when this war started. They had drafted a liberal constitution for a new Germany where they were willing to elect Frederick William IV, this same guy. They were willing to keep him and make him the emperor of the new Germany. But this war against Denmark wasted their time and allowed Frederick William to literally rally his troops for support. While the war was going on against Denmark, basically gathered his army and reasserted his divine right status, saying, I'm not a constitutional monarch, I am an absolute monarch, just like my predecessors, the Fredericks, with their strong army in Prussia. And he said, I'm going to make a conservative empire, not a liberal empire, no liberal constitution. I am going to be the emperor of Germany myself. And he went directly to the 38 German princes behind the back of the Frankfurt Assembly and said, choose me as the new emperor of Germany, not just of Prussia, but of Germany, and reestablish that through me. And he said, I won't take the crown from the gutter. The Frankfurt Assembly is the gutter. Liberals are the gutter. I don't get my authority from them. I won't take it from you. I take it from God. I'm a divine right monarch. And again, it's all because that assembly had been sidetracked. They waited too long, and the king rallied and got his conservative forces around him. Meanwhile, the Austrians and the Russians had seen all of these changes happening. Russians had already crushed Hungarians in Austria, and now the Russians and Austrians are going to send in a threat against Frederick William and said, abandon all of your plans for German unification. There's not going to be Germany, or we're going to invade. This is about balance of power. The Austrians and the Russians were concerned that if there was a Germany, it would be too strong, which it was going to be someday, you know that, and it was going to throw off everything that they were doing as conservatives that have now been reestablished in those nations. The Russians have always been conservative, but now Austria is back conservative. And so they maintained the German Confederation. They threatened Frederick William. He abandoned everything, his plans, and the 38 little German states remained intact. No Germany until 1871. That's a different section, different chapter. It's going to happen a whole different way. So basically, we've come full circle in all of Europe, France, Austria, Prussia, major upheaval, major efforts at change, and in almost every case, it doesn't happen.